were rushed.
A very warm welcome to World 360 with me, Akanksha Swaroop. Now, December has kicked off on a significant note for India, with G20 and UNSC Presidency officially coming to us, while the unprecedented protests in China have only highlighted the failure of President Xi's government. Before we dive deeper into our top stories, here's a quick look at the headlines first. Protests across China and vigils abroad highlight the Xi Jinping-led government's zero-COVID failure. While China's vice premier hints at a softening of stance, is China adequately prepared to do so? India officially assumes presidency of two global meetings, G20 and the UNSC. While the G20 presidency is driven by vision of oneness, UNSC leadership prioritizes counter-terror and multilateralism. US and India hit out at China for its objection to India-US joint military drills in the Indian border state of Uttarakhand. US echoes India's views regarding the Sino-India border agreements of 1993 and 96. And Twitter CEO Elon Musk exposes internal documents revealing deliberations made by the previous management regarding Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020. The so-called Twitter files disclose the controversial decision taken just weeks before the 2020 US presidential election. Now, while the world has learned to live with COVID, China still has not. The recent unrest that took place at the Foxconn plant in China's Jiangzhou is a stark example of China's zero-COVID policy going haywire. China's vice premier has hinted at the administration softening its zero-COVID policy, but the question that arises now is that without a forward plan in mind, President Xi's government has opened more questions than answers. Here's a report. Chants of Xi Jinping step down and Communist Party step down resounded in a reported 24 cities across China. These unprecedented protests for Xi Jinping's government have seen hundreds of people take to the streets. Symbolized by blank A4 sheets, the demonstrations swiftly evolved into a wave of civil disobedience. In fact, the protests spilled over to Hong Kong, even Chinese embassies in global metropolises like London, Paris and Tokyo, and universities in US and Europe.
It's surprising in the sense that compared to protests in China in the 1990s and 2000s, and we see a lot of protests, but many of these protests restrain themselves by targeting local officials and trying to express their loyalty to the center. But this time you see slogans chanting like Xi Jinping step down and even some call for freedom of expression.
Reports say China's people have accessed banned apps like Twitter, Telegram and Instagram through virtual private networks, only to communicate and organize anti-zero COVID policy protests. And it is from there that the counter crackdown arrived. In Beijing and Shanghai, cops scanned phones, forcibly deleted photos and videos of protests. Non-compliance meant arrests and even violence.
The zero-COVID policy caused the basic officials to directly face the people's pressure. So the dissatisfaction of both the peoples and the officials merged. I think this is a very severe challenge to the central government in Beijing and the CCP.
Days later, a new twist takes place. Announcements of a softening of stance. Chinese state media Xinhua reported Vice Premier Sun Chunlan as saying the virus's ability to cause disease was weakening. Reportedly, Chanlan also urged further optimization of testing, treating and quarantine policies, but did not directly refer to China's zero COVID policy. So what caused the turnaround? Besides the impact on citizens, China's strict containment measures have impacted the country's economy, hit hard by prolonged lockdowns. But will China's shift in tone mean anything without a roadmap? One that's meant to ease the rising frustrations on ground level. Bureau Report, CNN News 18. But that's not all that happened in China. This week, the former president of the People's Republic of China, Zemin, passed away at the age of 96. He was suffering from leukemia and experienced multiple organ failure. He was the first Chinese head of state to visit New Delhi in the year 1996. India's embassy in Beijing also expressed its deepest condolences over the passing of the former president. And for more details in terms of what China is going through, let's quickly go across to my guest, Mr. Ainar Tangen, who's a political commentator and joining me live from Beijing. Thank you so much, Ainar, for joining in on my show, World 360. Now, China's state media Xinhua has quoted its vice premier saying that China is now ready to adjust their zero COVID strategy. What explains the decision to soften the restrictions, that too just a week after the country reported a record surge in COVID cases?
Well, there's a number of instances. Obviously, the very strong reaction by many people, the frustration that was shared, sparked by the situation with the World Cup, people watching it, and the economic distress. But they're not, I don't think they're abandoning zero COVID. What they're doing is adjusting it. They're going to allow people to quarantine at home unless they need a hospitalization. They are going to get rid of these mass lockdowns and just simply have people, as I said, stay in their homes. If they have been infected, whether they're asymptomatic or not, that's going to require more testing. And they're going to put a tremendous amount more emphasis on getting vaccines, especially to the elderly. You'll have to see if they're going to mandate that or if that's going to be voluntary. But they're offering help, like they will have technicians go to people's homes if they don't want to go out and to administer these vaccinations, and that should help a lot.
All right. Now, Aina, the passing away of China's former president Jiang Zemin at a time when China has witnessed mass protests has arrived as a jolt to the masses. Could you tell us more about Zemin as a political figure and his contribution to China's growth as a global superpower?
Well, Jiang Zemin will, he will definitely be, if there's a Mount Rushmore, which is the place in the United States where they have, some of the most influential presidents carved in stone, he would definitely be among them. I mean, you have Mao, you have Deng, you have Jiang, you have Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. They've all contributed in their own way. Jiang was at a period where he saw the reunification with Hong Kong,
right.
The entrance in the WTO, founding of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, well, not founding, but the proponent of it, and getting it China and other countries to go along with it. So he had and double-digit growth during his period. He was at a time when China was opening up. He was be remembered for his very outspoken, very colorful character, very much different from the kind of reserved, kind of poker-faced. But there can be no mistake. He will be remembered as one of the lions of Chinese history, modern Chinese history. So, the people of China, they look back. There's both sweet and sour. Remember, he came in after 1989, after Tiananmen Square. And he, accomplished a lot, but he was, no pushover. He was not tolerant of Falun Gong, who he really believed was trying to undermine the party, who had very strange ideas, considered them a cult that was trying to make inroads into China and destabilize the government.
Right. In fact, it's interesting to see the kind of contrast that's being drawn in the media between Jiang, Zemin and the current president, Xi Jinping. Many thanks to you, Ainar Tangen, for bringing in all those precious inputs. But what's the reality like on ground level in China? Because we've seen these protests spread across China and, in fact, even abroad. Here's CNN's Stephen Jiang bringing us more inputs.
The authorities have not acknowledged that protests took place, let alone admitting the demonstrations prompted changes or adjustments in their COVID enforcements in recent days. So what seems to be happening is a two-pronged approach in terms of the official reaction to the protest. On the one hand, they're ramping up and continuing their clampdown on any open dissent. We have spoken to some protesters who told us police have tracked them down by geolocating their phones to protest locations. So there's a lot of high-tech surveillance and the crackdown going on. But on the other hand, in cities across the country, we have seen local authorities lifting long-standing lockdowns and removing or at least reducing testing requirements for certain segments of the population. And in some cases, for the first time, people who test positive are allowed to quarantine at home instead of being sent to those mass facilities, often in horrific conditions. But the problem here is a lack of consistency or lack of clarity, and the underlying challenges facing the authorities very much remains the same in terms of the lack of medical resources dealing with a potential surge of severe cases, as well as the relatively low vaccination rate among the elderly. So zero COVID is definitely not ending overnight, but if there's one positive sign we have noticed this time around is the shifting messaging and propaganda from state media. For the first time in a long time, they stopped demonizing the virus. Instead, they're saying things like the current Omicron variant is much milder and weaker than its predecessors, possibly setting the stage for an eventual exit from the zero COVID policy. Stephen Jiang reporting from Beijing.
When we speak of China, what stands out this week is the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's speech. He delivered his first major foreign policy speech in which he outlined UK's priorities. Downing Street reiterated that both the UK and India are very committed towards a free trade agreement and that quality won't be sacrificed to achieve speed and that a deal will be signed when interests are balanced between both the countries. But more importantly, when it came to China, Rishi Sunak declared that the UK's golden era of ties with China is over. He described China's growing authoritarianism as a reason for the end and called China a systemic challenge to the UK's values and interests. And with that, let's quickly go across to CNN News 18's Sanjay Suri, who's joining me live from London. Sanjay, thank you for joining in. Now, the UK Prime Minister has suggested a hardening of diplomatic relations with China and called the country a systemic challenge. Considering it was his first major foreign policy speech, how significant, in your view, is Sunak's current stance on China?
As it happens, this description of China as a systemic challenge to Britain is not new. This very expression has been used by the British government before in relation to China. Rishi Sunak certainly had come up with some hard talk on China early on in his election campaign among MPs and then among Conservative Party members. But this expression is not of itself an indication of a hardening of position. What is new is his statement and his declaration that the way to deal with China is not through sharpened rhetoric, but through what he called robust pragmatism. What exactly does that mean? We are again into guessing games here. We are waiting to see exactly what will be the specific expression of that idea of robust pragmatism.
In fact, it would be interesting to see what that robust pragmatism means for India. And speaking of which, if one were to take into consideration India and UK's forward movement on the much-awaited FTA, could India benefit from UK's hardening approach towards China?
On the FTA, we could be looking at a hardening of position with India, really. This agreement had been more or less concluded by Diwali, but the negotiations have been reopened because the new Rishi Sunak government wanted to drive a hard bargain and to link some of the trade matters with some migration demands that the British government has of India. clearly, this is important to the British government to have an FTA with India, and Rishi Sunak mentioned it in passing through his speech. He was speaking more widely of the importance of the Indo-Pacific region to Britain. That also is earlier British policy, and within that context, he spoke of Indonesia rather than India as the new hero of the region, the up-and-coming growth story. But no indication at all that Rishi Sunak would do anything to favor India over China in any investment or a trade matter.
All right, many thanks to you, Sanjay, for putting the entire story into perspective for us. And with that, let's now talk about India, which has now assumed the presidency of two global meetings this month, the G20 and the UNSC. Speaking of G20 first, which is driven by the vision of oneness, India will see a year-long series of meetings which will culminate in a summit in New Delhi on September of 2023. Meanwhile, India's leadership at the UNSC will focus on countering terrorism and reformed multilateralism. New Delhi will host a vast range of power meetings, approve provisional agendas, and sign records of the meetings besides other crucial decisions.
So the Prime Minister will be interacting with all the leaders of the Global South before we get into the Leaders Conference. We have interacted informally with many countries of the South. In fact, at Bali, we emerged as the voice of the South because we interacted with all the countries. We worked with Brazil, South Africa, Argentina, Mexico, Saudi, UAE, Singapore, and brought in sanity to the whole process. And that is what led to the final communique. And I think the process of interacting with the Global South, because that's one of the biggest challenges. We could have the debt sustainability initiative during the Saudi presidency due to Prime Minister Modi's initiative. And we will carry forward this because 70 countries across the world are impacted by global debt. Now, the global debt is IMF, there's the Paris Bank, there's Chinese debt, there's private debt. All this needs to be discussed, debated, and sorted out. And we will play that role of finding out the right solution for countries which are impacted by the global debt.
In other stories related to India, the US has affirmed that it stands with India and against China's objections to the India-US joint military exercises in the border state of Uttarakhand. After China said the exercises in India violate the spirit of two border agreements, the Indian Foreign Ministry gave a sharp response asking China to reflect and think about its own breach of these agreements of 1993 and 1996. And the US chargé d'affaires in India simply snubbed China by stating that it's none of their business. Let's also play out Arindam Bagchi's reaction.
Let me emphasize that these exercises that are going on with the US, I think in Oli, these have nothing to do with the 1993 and 1996 agreements that was asked in the question. But since these were raised and we're talking about them and it was raised by the Chinese side, let me emphasize that the Chinese side needs to reflect and think about its own breach of these agreements of 1993 and 1996. India exercises with whomsoever it chooses to, and it does not give a veto to third countries on this issue.
Now, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has accused NATO of trying to drag India into what he called an anti-Russian and anti-Chinese alliance at a time when what he called the West was attempting to squeeze out Russian influence. India gave a befitting response with India's envoy to the UN, Ruchira Kamboj, saying that India is a country that stands tall and proud on its own. Lavrov also said that the South China Sea is now becoming one of those regions where NATO is not averse, as they once did in Ukraine, to escalate tensions. Remember, Lavrov was also trying to draw parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan. And here's another controversy now brewing. Twitter's new CEO, Elon Musk, has exposed internal documents revealing deliberations made by the previous management regarding Hunter Biden's laptop back in the year 2020. The so-called Twitter files disclose the controversial decision that was taken 3 weeks before the 2020 US presidential election. Musk's team apparently provided newsletter author Matt Taibbi with access to internal documents surrounding Twitter's controversial decision, after which Taibbi unrolled a barrage of posts stretched out across nearly 2 hours. The Twitter thread included half a dozen screenshots of executives debating about Hunter Biden's laptop report. And with that, it's time to slip into a quick break, but don't go anywhere because I'll be back with the latest on the racism row that's plaguing the UK's Buckingham Palace, that too at a time when Kate and William are visiting the United States.